What if your belly fat is not a sign of weakness, but an ancient emergency program of your body? Every morning, millions of people wake up with a firm resolution. Today I will eat less. Today discipline begins. Today the belly fat finally disappears. But just a few hours later, they are standing in front of the refrigerator again. Not truly hungry, the stomach is not growling, and yet the hand automatically reaches for something sweet or fatty. Afterward comes the guilt, the thought, I have no willpower. But while this moment feels like a personal failure, something far more powerful is happening in the background. Deep in the brain, an ancient biological program is being activated, a system that saved lives 200,000 years ago and is misdirected in the modern world today. For human biology, it makes no difference whether a saber-toothed tiger is standing in front of you or an aggressive message from your boss lights up on your smartphone. Both are interpreted as a threat. Both activate the same stress axis. Both mean danger. And when the body perceives danger, it does not switch into fat-burning mode. It switches into survival mode. Energy is mobilized. Sugar is pumped into the bloodstream. Systems like digestion or muscle building are dialed down. Everything focuses on a single priority, safety. However, if this threat is not discharged through movement, if no one runs from a tiger but instead remains sitting at a desk, the released energy stays in the blood. The body responds with a plan B. It stores, and specifically, it stores where it can quickly access it in an emergency, deep in the abdominal cavity, around the liver, intestines, and pancreas. This visceral fat is not a harmless cushion. It is metabolically active. It sends out inflammatory messengers, influences hormones, and increases the long-term risk of cardiovascular disease. It is not a cosmetic problem. It is a biological shield. The architect behind this protective mechanism is called cortisol. So what exactly happens in the body when stress becomes chronic? Why does the organism defend this fat like a fortress? And how can you prove to your own nervous system that the war has long been over? To understand this, you have to dive deeper into stress biology, into human evolution, and into the hours in which metabolism decides, store or burn.
Before you understand how to reduce visceral fat, you must understand what it actually is. Not all body fat is the same. Directly beneath the skin lies what is called subcutaneous fat. It is soft, visible, and for many people, primarily an aesthetic issue. But deeper in the abdominal cavity, tightly wrapped around the liver, pancreas, and intestines, there is another type of fat tissue, visceral fat. And this fat does not behave like a silent energy storage site. It is biologically active. You could say it functions like its own hormonal organ. Visceral fat produces inflammatory messengers, so-called cytokines, such as interleukin-6 or TNF-alpha. It influences insulin sensitivity. It communicates directly with the liver through the portal vein. Studies show that a higher proportion of visceral fat is strongly associated with type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. It is metabolically more dangerous than fat on the hips or thighs. But here lies the crucial question. Why does the body store fat precisely in this sensitive area? The answer leads directly to the hormone cortisol. Cortisol is produced in the adrenal glands. It is part of the so-called HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This system is the central stress response network of the body. As soon as the brain registers a threat, the hypothalamic sends a signal. The pituitary gland responds, and the adrenal glands release cortisol. Cortisol has a clear mission: provide energy. It raises blood sugar by stimulating glucose production in the liver. It inhibits processes that are not essential for immediate survival, such as digestion or reproduction. It mobilizes amino acids from muscle tissue to provide additional energy sources. In the short term, this is life-saving. Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky does not describe cortisol as a bad hormone, but as a tool of adaptation. Without cortisol, humans could not respond to danger. The problem does not arise from cortisol itself, but from its chronic activation. In a natural environment, stress was acute and short-term. The saber-toothed tiger appeared and disappeared. Cortisol levels rose and then fell again. But in the modern world, stress rarely ends completely. Constant connectivity, social comparison, financial insecurity, sleep deprivation, all of this keeps the stress axis active.
And here begins the biological shift. Chronically elevated cortisol changes where and how the body stores energy. Fat cells in the abdominal cavity possess particularly many cortisol receptors. They respond more sensitively to this hormone than other fat depots. That means when cortisol is regularly elevated, storage is preferred where receptor density is highest, in the visceral region. At the same time, stress also often raises insulin levels. Cortisol increases blood sugar. Insulin must follow in order to transport this sugar into the cells. But insulin is a storage signal. When cortisol and insulin are high at the same time, a hormonal state emerges that tells the body, secure energy, build reserves, prepare for crisis. What outwardly looks like a growing belly, biologically speaking, is a safety mechanism. The body does not build fat to sabotage you. It builds it to protect you. It believes that another threat is imminent. And visceral fat is strategically located, close to the liver, quickly mobilizable, efficiently accessible. But this mechanism, which once ensured survival, becomes a chronic burden in a world without tigers. The crucial question, therefore, is not only, how do you burn fat, but rather, how do you signal to the nervous system that there is no permanent danger? To answer that, you must understand what happens in the body in the first hours of stress, and what happens when this state lasts for days, weeks, or years.
The moment a threat is perceived, an aggressive message, a conflict, a financial worry, the brain activates the amygdala. It sends a signal to the hypothalamus. Within seconds, the stress axis starts. Adrenaline shoots into the bloodstream, heart rate rises, blood pressure rises, the pupils dilate. Shortly afterward, cortisol follows. The adrenal glands begin releasing the hormone. According to stress researchers such as Robert Sapolsky, this is the second wave of the stress response, slower than adrenaline, but more sustained. The body prepares for movement, but in modern reality, that movement usually does not happen. Cortisol stimulates the liver to perform gluconeogenesis, the production of new glucose. At the same time, amino acids are released from muscle tissue to serve as fuel. Blood sugar levels rise. If this energy is not burned, insulin must intervene. It transports the excess glucose out of the bloodstream, and this is where storage begins. Insulin acts like a warehouse manager. Its message is, store, now. If cortisol remains elevated, a paradoxical situation develops. The body releases energy and simultaneously stores it again. The goal is not weight loss. The goal is safety. If stress persists, insulin sensitivity gradually declines. Cells respond less effectively to insulin. The pancreas produces more of it. Chronically elevated cortisol levels also increase the activity of certain enzymes in visceral fat cells, particularly 11-beta-HSD1, which can locally amplify cortisol. This means, in the abdominal area, cortisol becomes biologically even more powerful. Visceral fat cells begin to absorb and store energy more efficiently. At the same time, cortisol inhibits muscle growth. The body shifts resources away from muscle tissue towards central energy storage. Over time, this leads to what is known as the skinny fat phenomenon. Studies show that even one night with less than 6-7 hours of sleep significantly reduces insulin sensitivity. Sleep researcher Matthew Walker describes sleep as a metabolic reset. If this reset is missing, cortisol remains elevated in the morning. The body starts the day already in alarm mode. At the same time, the hunger-regulating hormone ghrelin rises, while leptin decreases. The result, more hunger, more stress, more storage. If this state lasts for weeks or months, fat distribution and metabolism change structurally. Visceral fat not only grows, it becomes inflammation active. It continuously releases cytokines. The liver becomes more insulin resistant. The risk of metabolic syndrome increases. The body enters a state of permanent war. Not because real danger exists, but because the nervous system never receives the all clear. This is where the story reaches its turning point. If stress stores fat, then the solution is not primarily more discipline or fewer calories. The solution begins at the level of the nervous system. Before fat can be burned, safety must be established. And this is exactly where the next section begins.
If chronic stress promotes visceral fat, then simply counting calories is not enough. The body does not store because of a lack of discipline. It stores because it suspects danger. The central question, therefore, is, how do you convince a biological system that there is no threat? The answer does not begin in the gym. It begins in the nervous system. Cortisol is not inherently harmful. On the contrary, it follows a natural daily rhythm. In the morning, levels are highest. This is called the cortisol awakening response. It helps you wake up. After that, cortisol should gradually decline throughout the day. It becomes problematic when this rhythm is disrupted. Persistently elevated levels, late cortisol spikes in the evening, a flattened daily curve due to chronic stress. The most important regulator of this rhythm is sleep. Regular sleep times, 7 to 9 hours of sleep, Darkness at night and daylight in the morning are not wellness tips, they are hormonal control mechanisms. Anyone who gets light exposure in the morning and reduces artificial light in the evening stabilizes their stress axis. A stable rhythm signals to the body, the environment is predictable, no acute danger. From an evolutionary perspective, stress was almost always linked to movement, fight or flight. Today, the body often remains motionless, despite an internal alarm response. Moderate exercise, therefore, acts like a biological completion of the stress response. It burns the released glucose, lowers cortisol after exertion, and improves insulin sensitivity. However, dosage matters. Overtraining can itself act as a stressor. Chronically high intensity without recovery further increases cortisol. The most effective strategy is a combination of strength training to preserve muscle mass and insulin sensitivity, moderate endurance training, low-intensity daily movement. Muscle tissue is metabolically active. The higher the muscle mass, the better glucose can be absorbed without immediately converting it into fat. Muscle is a safety factor. Cortisol raises blood sugar. Insulin stores it. Constant blood sugar spikes caused by highly processed carbohydrates or continuous snacking intensify this cycle. A diet with sufficient protein, fiber-rich carbohydrates, healthy fats slows glucose absorption and reduces insulin spikes. Protein plays a dual role. It stabilizes blood sugar and protects against muscle breakdown under stress. The goal is not extreme restriction. The goal is metabolic stability. The body does not clearly distinguish between physical and social threats. Social isolation, chronic self-criticism, or constant performance pressure activate the same stress axes as real danger. Studies in psychoneuroendocrinology show that perceived control is a decisive factor. People who feel capable of acting show lower chronic cortisol levels, even under objectively high stress. Safety is created through social connection, routines, breathing techniques, meditation, conscious stress regulation. Slow, controlled breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system. Heart rate decreases. Cortisol is no longer further stimulated. This is not an esoteric approach. It is autonomic neurophysiology. When cortisol drops and insulin remains stable, the body can once again switch more flexibly between energy sources. This state is called metabolic flexibility. In a safe state, the body more readily accesses stored energy, including visceral fat, not because you force it, but because it no longer believes it needs to build reserves. Fat burning is not a fight against the body. It is a byproduct of safety. Visceral fat is not a moral failure. It is a biological signal. A signal that the stress system has been active for too long. Anyone who works only on the surface, reducing calories, increasing training volume, without considering the stress axis, is treating symptoms. But anyone who stabilizes their cortisol rhythm, builds muscle mass, regulates blood sugar, and creates psychological safety, changes the cause. And this is exactly the difference between short-term weight loss and long-term metabolic health.
Perhaps the most important insight from all of this is the following. Visceral fat is not a sign of weakness. It is a biological protocol. A protocol of how often your nervous system has registered danger, how often cortisol has been released, how long your body believed it needed to prepare for a crisis. Most people wage war against their own bodies. They drastically reduce calories. They train to exhaustion. They punish themselves for every gram of fat. But the body does not respond to punishment. It responds to safety. When the nervous system receives the all clear, when sleep becomes regular, when movement is not stress but regulation, when blood sugar remains stable, then metabolism changes. Not abruptly, not magically, but biologically logical. Visceral fat begins to shrink when the body recognizes the threat is over. Chronic stress increases cortisol. Elevated cortisol alters fat distribution. Safety reverses this process. So before you plan your next diet, ask yourself a different question. What does your cortisol rhythm look like? How are you sleeping? How often does your daily life feel like a constant state of alarm? Start there. Build stability first, then intensity. Regulation before restriction. Safety before self-optimization. When you understand how your body responds to stress, you no longer work against it, but with it. And that is exactly the difference between short-term change and sustainable health. If you would like, next we can refine the entire text dramaturgically, more tension, shorter sentences, YouTube optimized, or incorporate scientific sources for maximum authority, or create a version that is more emotional and narrative-driven.